Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan claims that her government's proposed changes to anti-vilification laws will, quote, help restore social cohesion. Following what we know, of course, is the shocking rise of antisemitism right across the state. It's happening everywhere, but it's been particularly bad in New South Wales and Victoria. But critics have raised concerns that the reforms could actually end up threatening free speech, with the Institute of Public Affairs warning Victoria could become, quote, the censorship capital of Australia. Joining me now is research fellow at the IPA, Margaret Chambers. Margaret, thank you very much for joining us. Explain to me what your research shows about this piece of legislation and what actually alarms you about it.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Steve. Well, we've looked at these laws and we've found that they are corrosive and pernicious insofar as they'll hand a sword to activists to shut down opinions that they disagree with. Now, these have absolutely been framed in terms of combating anti-Semitism and restoring social cohesion in our state, but it's really not about that at all. What it is about is controlling opinions, particularly around things like gender and sexuality. And the way that that works in the laws is that it's actually going to be unlawful to say anything that someone could consider to be hateful based on certain protected traits. Now, I'm sure you agree with me, Steve, that hateful is an entirely subjective standard. It means completely different things to different people, and it's an entirely inappropriate standard for legislation. So what that will mean is that activists can use these laws to drag people into the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission simply just to shut down their opinions that they disagree with.
Yeah, so what puzzles me with all of this, we already have hate speech laws, national laws and state laws. When people then try to toughen them up, you do have to ask the question, why are you not using the laws we currently have, and why do they need to be tougher?
Yeah, and I think you've raised a really good point, Steve. We already have laws for all sorts of things like this. We have laws that should prevent arson, they should prevent racial discrimination, they should be preventing things that we've seen all throughout communities in the aftermath of the October 7 conflict, and we're not seeing these enforced. So what I think we should be asking ourselves is, why is that? Why are our laws not being enforced? And what we're seeing in Canberra and what we're seeing in the Victorian State Parliament is that it's taken an election to actually mobilise some action, and it's this desire to be seen to be doing something that's motivating politicians to actually take action. But we've seen, in other words, a total lack of responsibility to cut down on this anti-Semitism in our communities.
Margaret, it's not just the Victorian laws, of course. We're in the middle of a debate about federal changes, hate laws. These have been backed by both Labor and the Liberal Party, but not the crossbench. How concerned are you about these raft of new federal legislation that's being rammed through the Parliament?
I'm very concerned, and I'm very concerned because our Parliament is not being used to debate and scrutinise legislation as it should be. That's the whole purpose of the Senate and the Upper House. It should be used to carefully examine the unintended consequences of laws. But what we saw yesterday in Parliament with the hate crimes bill is that we had an agreement between the Coalition and Labor to ram these laws through, and what we're seeing is that people are deeply concerned about the unintended consequences, particularly on free speech and religious freedom, that these laws will have.
So what would you like our lawmakers to do? Would you leave the laws we currently have in place and just police them properly instead of inserting all of these new clauses into the legislation?
Yes, I'd like to see the enforcement of our existing legislation. And what I would actually really love to see in Australia, and particularly in my home state of Victoria, is a genuine commitment to freedom of speech and religious freedom. You know, at every turn, we've seen the freedoms of Victorians cut down and curtailed by this government. I'm very sceptical that this government really cares about religious freedom and about freedom of speech. But what I want to see is some actual political courage to enforce the laws and take a strong stance against cutting down on anti-Semitism in our communities.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with you. Margaret, thank you very much for joining us tonight.